Okay, our guest today is Professor Cornelius Holtorf, and he is an archaeologist and researcher currently holding the UNESCO Chair on Heritage Futures here at Linnaeus University. And the theme for his professorship is the future of heritage and how we handle our caretaking of heritage in relation to future interests and needs. And today, Cornelius will connect the theme of well-being with this ongoing research field on the future for heritage. After Cornelius' presentation, it's possible to post questions and add comments via the Q&A function in this webinar. And you can also do it during the lecture, of course, but what you put there will then be moderated by me by the end of Cornelius' lecture. And with these words, I leave the word to you, Cornelius, to continue your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Bodil, and I'm sorting out my screens here. So when I look up like this, then I look at Bodil at the moment and Zoom, and my presentation is down here. So just that you understand. It's very nice to be invited to this occasion and present some thoughts on well-being and the future. So and I see that people are still dropping in, but that's fine. And of course, it will also be recorded so that maybe others who can watch this in the future, in fact. So you see, I'm based at Linnaeus University in Sweden, one of the partners of the EUniWell consortium. And I have my title here, Cultural Heritage, Well-being, and the Future. And what I really want to talk about is that, because not all of you, of course, are archaeologists or heritage specialists, what I want to talk about is how the past today is not what it used to be. And there have been a lot of changes actually in how heritage is managed and how the past is perceived today in its relation to the needs of contemporary society. And well-being plays an important role in that context. And that's what I will be talking about. But before I get into this, I thought I'd say a few words on the chair here at Linnaeus University that I'm working on. And this is the UNESCO Chair on Heritage Futures, which Bodil already mentioned. And Heritage Futures is a new term which not everybody may be familiar with. So that's why I put here our definition of what that means. So Heritage Futures is about the roles of heritage in managing the relations between present and future societies. So it's not about predicting the future in a way that nobody else can, and it's not about conserving as much as possible of the past for future purposes, but it is very much about how present and the future are linked and what we can do today that will affect the future and how our decisions today have an impact in the future. And through the course of my lecture, you'll see examples, especially towards the end, on what that may mean. And then I think at the very end, it will sort of fall into place how we work. Our team is, this is a picture that was taken immediately before the pandemic. So today we are 9 people affiliated with the chair, and it's a mix of all sorts of people on all sorts of levels, from PhD students all the way up to 2 professors actually who work in this framework. And we also have a vision. So this is what we try to do, because as you may know or may not know actually, these UNESCO chairs, they're not pure research chairs, but they are about making an impact in society and about collaboration and policy making, and so it's a much broader agenda than normal chairs. So our vision reflects that, and we say that what we're doing is we're building global capacity for futures thinking among heritage professionals. So it's about promoting what we call futures literacy for our sector in the world. Now, surprisingly, this is something that hasn't been done before. So it's a new topic. That's what makes it all worthwhile, we hope. But in a way, of course, this is surprising because the heritage sector has long been talking about future generations. Often in this context, there is this phrase which has become almost a mantra in our sector, that we need to preserve the heritage for the benefit of future generations. And when we started working on this, which is now about 10 years ago, my colleague Anders Högberg and I did a survey among heritage professionals in different countries and on all levels, from the people who make the decisions on the ground in the local authorities, all the way up to the responsible person at UNESCO. And none of them had ever professionally asked themselves this question on which future are we actually working for, and how do we know that what we do concerning heritage in the present will actually have benefits in the future, and what benefits might that be? And what that told us is that very often there's an assumption that the value of heritage is timeless. It's not something that sort of comes and goes, but it is something that is inherent in the very material we're dealing with. And all we need to do is to take care of this material and make it accessible, both to present and to future generations. And that will generate the benefits almost automatically. Now, these are ideas that abound on all levels in the sector, and we come across them all the time. And that's exactly what we want to change, really, to put more effort into answering these questions: which futures do we have in mind, and what sort of benefits do we think the heritage will have? And then, of course, how can we maximize these benefits and minimize any worries and concerns and risks that may be also there, may also be a consequence of the heritage in the future. Right, and what I want to do today to show you that heritage is not at all timeless, but it is something that goes through changes, and that is and both the very notion of heritage, but also where its value for society lies, has changed rather dramatically over the past 200 years or so, since when this notion of heritage was created. So when I'm arguing that the idea of cultural heritage follows the flows of history and cultural change, and is nothing that is timeless. And that, of course, means that it is also something that will change in the future. And we shouldn't take for granted that the way we see heritage today and how we define its benefits and uses, that they remain the same. And that's, of course, where well-being comes into the picture also later on. But before we get to that, let me just run very briefly through the various, I argue here that it's three main complementary stages in the history of heritage that we can distinguish. There may be more if you look at it in a sort of more detailed scale, but I think these are three different ways of in which heritage has been conceived, and a different relation to society was established and practiced. And as it says here, that these are complementary stages, so they're not mutually exclusive. And there's all of these three stages are still existent today, and there's an overlap between them, obviously, as well. But nevertheless, they do represent three different ways of seeing heritage. And so I'll first be talking a bit on romantic nationalism, which is where heritage originated from, and then on something that I call tourism, because that's a good shorthand for the second stage. And then the most recent stage, which is ongoing and probably developing a lot more over coming years, is the one associated with sustainable development. And that's where well-being plays a big role. So let me start with here a few words on romantic nationalism. This is, of course, something that many of you will be familiar with also from other contexts, a period about 200 years ago, that shaped a lot of the characteristics of the modern nation states, and that included heritage, because heritage is one of the formative aspects of the nation state, and that is reflected in, for example, in the national legislation that protects heritage relatively strongly. If you look at what it is really, the remains of people who lived in the same area maybe thousands of years ago, definitely hundreds of years ago. It's also the time when sometimes as a result of legislation, when major heritage institutions were established, like national museums, for example. And it's linked to the universities, and which are part of the educational ambitions of the modern nation state. And so this connection between learning about the past and education about the past is also formative for the nation. And that's, of course, where heritage and history generally come into the picture here as well. Now, if you're asking what does that mean for heritage practice, then this is the approach that basically focuses on preserving monuments. And saying monuments, then this means the tangible fabric of monuments. So the physical remains of the past, they become protected as the national heritage. That is what is being displayed in museums, and that's what also education about the especially the distant past focuses on a great deal. And if you are interested in policy documents, then maybe the one document that is most strongly linked to this thinking is the Venice Convention from 1964, that really focuses on the tangible fabric of the heritage, and how this needs to be maintained and made visible also in heritage monuments. Now, I have one image here that I want to illustrate these ideas of romantic nationalism with, and that connects this to world heritage, because you could argue that world heritage is sort of the ultimate outcome of the romantic nationalist thinking of heritage. And that's mostly because of the first two letters of the word UNESCO, which of course represent the United Nations. And so it's all about the nation state, and you see this on this graphic, and if you look for it on Google, there is any number of representations of how many World Heritage Sites are located in the different nations of the world. And of course, the nations are the member states of the World Heritage Convention. And you see, for example, on this, which is the most recent statistics from August last year, that Italy leads this league of sites with 58, ahead of China with 56, and so on. And all of this implies that the notion of the nation is entirely unproblematic. This is just the way the world is, and heritage just is naturally associated with the idea of the nation. So there's this idea of the nation as something timeless. And of course, we see this not only in the context of heritage, but recently we all may have been watching the Olympic Games on television, and that's more or less the same. It's not primarily about sports anymore, but it's very much about how many medals each nation gets, and who boycotts whom, and all of these things. So that's another example for similar sort of thinking, where this is seen as completely natural. There's no other way of doing sports events globally, and maybe there's no other way of managing a global heritage. Even though, of course, this is very doubtful, and in fact, there are already other ways as well. But I think you get the message. This is a certain context within which heritage has a given role in society, and it started about 200 years ago, and it's still very much part of our world today. But there's a second approach, a second stage in this development where things change quite a bit. And that's the one which I called tourism here, because tourism is the one aspect that's always emphasized, even though it's only a shorthand for a much larger way of thinking. And this is a way of thinking that it's not dominated by national thinking, but it's dominated by economic thinking, and it's a very strong focus on the market and on customers and so on. So dominant terms here are consumption of heritage, and I put the euro sign here because it's also very much about money. And in this thinking, the outcome of heritage and cultural tourism more generally is very much measured in financially, in monetary values, and all these statistics that I think a lot of us have seen, where we need to sort of specify how much money is this particular project going to make for the region, or for a particular place or a particular institution, or how many jobs will be created through this particular project. All of this reflects the sort of thinking that there is a particular value, a monetary value often, that is associated with the way in which heritage and culture more generally is consumed. Now, there's a critical approach to this. Of course, not everybody likes that, and there's also a strong critical literature that has been problematizing this for a long time, ever since Robert Hewson wrote in the 80s already that there are problematics with the problems with the heritage industry. This was the first book that made this case very strongly, and this is about the time when this thinking here became dominant, late 80s, early 90s, and onwards. And so in terms of heritage practice, this is no longer about preserving fabric, but it is a lot about, there's a great focus on value, and that also means on different values for different people. It's about what heritage does in society, and who benefits and who doesn't benefit from it, and who may even be harmed by a particular overconsumption, maybe of cultural heritage. And there is even talk now of over-tourism, and heritage sites are one of the places where over-tourism occurs. Places like Venice, for example, come to mind. Now here, the focus is on values, on how heritage is perceived and how it's put to use in society in different ways. And as I said, the heritage, the value may be measured in monetary terms, financial terms, but it may also be measured in how does the local community benefit from a particular site, and how do they relate to it, and what sort of benefits, whether financial or other kinds of benefits, do they have from the site. I put down here also the word the intangible, because that's also the time when really the intangible heritage was noticed in a way that it maybe wasn't before. And there's a convention, the UNESCO Convention on the Intangible Heritage, that came much later than about 30 years later than the World Heritage Convention. And that reflects sort of the rise of the idea of the intangible heritage, which is all about practices and skills and music and traditions and so on. And there are some theoreticians, like, and I'm thinking in particular of Laura Jane Smith, who has been not just criticizing the authorized heritage discourse a lot for the effect this has on society, and she did that very much by looking at what heritage does in society. But she's also been arguing that all heritage is intangible heritage, because even the tangible monuments, the physical monuments, that they are only valuable because of what they do in society. That's very much an argument, and this is exactly this approach here. Now, I found here one specific example also. This is Mykonos. And sort of this exemplifies how heritage is perceived in this framework. So here we see the built heritage of Mykonos in the background, but we also see the people in the front. In fact, I can make this a bit larger, who are eating food and drinking wine, one presumes. So this is, and these are of course Greek dishes that they consume. So it's this is the intangible side of the heritage heritage is also illustrated here. And now, of course, one may analyze this particular situation here and ask, well, who benefits from this sort of heritage consumption? And you see the big cruise ship in the background. So often, maybe all these people come from this cruise ship. It's certainly conceivable. There are places where it works like this. And that means that it's the big multinational cruise ship companies that probably make the biggest profit out of this, monetary profit. Some money will go to the local community and the restaurant owners and so on, but probably not as much as one would hope, and certainly as they would hope. But we could also ask how do the tourists benefit, because they also benefit a lot, of course, otherwise they wouldn't pay for that. And there's lots to be said on tourism and tourist perceptions of different cultures. And if it's Tuesday, it must be Greece, those sort of things, and what they actually learn from heritage. And these are certainly also things that could be improved in some cases. But there may be lectures on the cruise ship, for example. There may be guided tours on Mykonos in this case, where people do learn something which is certainly valuable. And then on one final aspect here, which I would like to add, is that, of course, one could, since this is Greece, a Greek island, one could also think about, well, what about the refugees that may be on the very same island? And that it's not just that they're in a very difficult situation in many ways, that from given what they have escaped from, but it's also that they bring along a different kind of heritage, and which is not represented in this tourism, and also they would not feel themselves at home in this place, and would feel that they sort of are not part of the discourse that this particular form of tourism establishes on islands like Mykonos, but also in other places. So this is a second way in which heritage is put to use in society, and that, as I said, has been well established since the 1990s. And it's still very much with us. And it's all about a whole variety of heritage values. And some are very positive, and others are also quite problematic, and money rules in many cases. And well, you see this everywhere, even today. Right, but then there is a third one, and that's the approach I want to focus mostly on today and for the rest of this lecture. And that's the one which I've called sustainable development. And of course, you know where this term comes from. Now, this represents a completely different way of thinking, and this is about people-centered approaches. Now, that's a term that is everywhere at the moment in the heritage sector. And it's not just a phrase that people use. It does reflect a different kind of management and different kinds of priorities. And I put down here a reference again to a policy document, which is the Faro Convention, which is a European convention, which is maybe fitting in the context of the EUniWell collaboration. And the Faro Convention was the first convention of its kind in the world, actually, that focused on the value of cultural heritage for society. So it's not about the conservation of monuments anymore, but it's about what heritage does in society, what sort of values it brings to society, and that reflects the change that I talked about previously, and that is being taken here into even more extremely into a new direction, because this is no longer monuments or heritage focus in terms of what you're looking at, the object of your interest, or the symbol of the nation, but now the people are actually at the center. So value is no longer seen in terms of how the heritage is being perceived in different ways and put to use in different ways as before, but now the focus is entirely on the people. So it almost doesn't matter what they're looking at. What matters is what the people get out of it, irrespective of what really happens, and whether, for example, the heritage is authentic or not. That's much less a concern in this framework. It's more about perceptions and uses. And this is a contrast with the older thinking, especially the Venice Convention thinking, which was all about the preservation of cultural property, and also I put down here a note to a reference to the Hague Convention from 1954, which is very much current today because of the ongoing war in Ukraine, where a lot of organizations have emphasized that we need to preserve the Ukrainian cultural property. And that's very much the thinking associated with national romanticism and in this case, the Ukrainian nation state, and where the focus is on the objects and the museums or the sites and indeed the World Heritage sites that they have in Ukraine. And that's quite different from this thinking here, which is about what benefits do these sites bring to people. That's not something that you hear a lot about in the media at the moment. So here we're talking about uses and benefits for people, and also a lot about cultural rights. There is quite a big movement on top global levels to make heritage, or not just make, but implement the idea that heritage is a right of people, because it's part of the right to for people to have their own culture and to practice their own cultural traditions. So that means that it's entirely framed in people's terms. It's part of the human rights thinking that, of course, has been around for a long time, and that now has gained sort of a heritage aspect to that. And this is an idea that becomes ever more powerful at the moment, and it's associated also with indigenous rights, for example, where it's often very much a concern whether they can continue their own culture, or how this is put at risk at the moment for a number of reasons. So the focus entirely on people here. That's the point. Right, now to summarize so far, what we see is a shift of priorities, really, that goes all the way through the heritage sector, from the most global policy documents to what happens in communities and the demands people have on the heritage sector from the bottom up. So it's a focus that shifts the attention from monuments to people, and from objects to the value of these objects, from preservation to use, and from the national framework to a transnational framework. The idea of the nation is no longer as central as it used to be in this thinking. And in fact, a lot of the documents that guide these approaches are transnational or in fact supranational level. So for example, the Faro Convention, but also at the global level, there are various processes already which have started to promote this thinking. Now, this leads me to well-being, finally, because well-being is one of the primary approaches through which sustainable development can be reached in relation to heritage. And as you know, well-being is seen as an alternative to the traditional approaches that may be related to nationalism, or in fact to GDP. The gross domestic product, the term by which progress in society and specifically in the economy is measured still around the world. And so we see now that this is being challenged in various places, and that's why I asked you, so what is on the agenda instead? And I hope you excuse my pun here, because you probably know what's coming now. Well, if I ask what is on the agenda, well, then on the agenda is the Agenda 2030, very much at the moment in every state of the world, because all states have signed up to the agenda, but also very much in the heritage organizations in each state, but also the transnational and supranational heritage organizations that exists in the world. And in this thinking, you've all seen these 17 goals before, and there is quite a large consensus within the heritage sector that actually, even though heritage is only mentioned once as part of goal 11, it actually does have a role to play in relation to all of these goals, because heritage has such wide implications for how people live and how they think and the priorities and values that they apply in their lives and in their particular communities. we see more and more initiatives that are promoting heritage in this broad perspective and how it can contribute to make people's lives better. And you already get a sense here that this is about users and benefits in a very concrete way attached to these major global goals that we're talking about. Now, one specific example that I want to pick out here in this thinking is this. This is from Bhutan, actually, where they pioneered a concept some time ago that was and is going to still challenging the GDP approach, and they have developed something else which is called the GNH approach, and that stands for gross national happiness. So the idea here is that one no longer measures what is financially beneficial, because what does money actually mean? And more people think, well, maybe that's not what we actually need. So the GNH index here wants to measure what actually matters, which is not money. So what is it? So this particular graphic sums up the one particular approach. There are a few others, but this is sort of one that you come across quite often, and it shows you the variety of thinking. And if you just run through this quite quickly, just the headlines, you get a sense of what this is all about. So at the very top there is this reference to psychological well-being. So it's very much about how people feel, life satisfaction, etc. It's also connected to health. In different ways, of physical aspects, and of course mental health. That is several more attention for that in current society. And all these things, of course, do have a relation to heritage. There's a benefit that heritage can make, and that is already to some extent established today. I'll show you some examples in a moment. It's about time use. So how people actually use their lifetime, and whether this is something, whether they fill it with things they want to do, or what they have to do for work, for example, but also biologically, sleep it mentions here. It's about education, all the different aspects. We're well familiar with that. It's about cultural diversity and resilience. And again, you can immediately see the connection to heritage issues. So what do you identify yourself with? What languages do you speak? Are you feeling included in society? It's about good governance. So it's no longer about governments sort of protecting the heritage in their nation state, but this is about policymaking. It's about governance and fundamental rights that they ensure, the services they provide for communities, a democratic participation, and so on. It's a different way of looking at the state, and a different way than just question of who has the power. It's about community vitality. Community archaeology is a big thing as well. It's about ecological diversity and resilience, so the environmental dimension related to climate change to some extent, but also urbanization issues. And it's about living standards. So which is of course to do with, there's an economic aspect here as well, but it's no longer about counting euros. Instead, it's about what difference does it make for people's lives. And that's why this is something that matters rather than something that can be counted easily. So this is the approach that where well-being and heritage sort of come together in a completely different way than how heritage has been perceived previously. And what I want to do now is run you through some examples where this becomes even more clear how heritage plays a very specific role in relation to happiness and well-being of people. Now, a lot of these early studies, this is already 10 years ago here, for example, many of them come from the UK because it's one of these ideas that was pioneered there for the last 10 or 15 years. And one of the reports that I am citing here is called Heritage in Health. I've got that in here as well. And I thought it's quite revealing to read the first few sentences here from the foreword. So this is this is meant as a guide to using museum collections in hospitals and other healthcare settings, which has been done frequently, not just in the UK. There are quite a few projects where this has been tested. Now here it says this: quality engagement with museum collections enhances well-being. An increase in personal well-being is never the main objective for a museum professional, but working with objects and with diverse participants who bring with them a breadth of experience is intensely rewarding. If this occurs for museum professionals, what are the benefits for participants? So it's quite interesting how this is directed at the people in museums, so working within the heritage sector. But the report also, of course, exemplifies how the participants or patients have very concrete, measurable benefits, health benefits from these sort of projects where museum collections are put to use in hospitals, and patients get to handle them and reflect about them. And sometimes this can also be outdoors, and they may have a physical dimension or rehabilitation dimension as well. So this is one example for an early kind of work that is out there. And then here's another example. It's also from the UK. This is a study which is more recent, from 2018, called Wellbeing and the Historic Environment. And if we look at this graphic, I think it's quite interesting in which terms here the historic environment is discussed. So you see that the historic environment is seen in terms of the process with which it is, or the processes with which it is associated. So rather than focusing on what you are protecting or what you're caring for in the landscape, this is about how you do that. And you see in the first point on the far left that it's the social engagement that is important, the way it promotes self-esteem through the work you do. The way it gives meaning to people's lives, and an appreciation of being useful and needed in a social context. This can have enormous benefits for people in all sorts of different circumstances. It's about the benefits from visiting sites as participants, not just knowledge, but also other positive feelings and the group activities that may go on at the same time, how you relate to other visitors. It's about sharing things, the creativity that is involved, sometimes memories that may be part of it, the interaction generally that goes on in groups in the historic environment. It may sometimes be connected to healing and therapy, along the lines that I mentioned before. Self-expression, self-esteem are obviously key aspects of that. Places may be important in terms of belonging. So identity is not a new idea, but it's being approached in a different way here. It's about a connection to the land, which promotes resilience, which makes your life more meaningful and gives you a secure place in society. And it's about experiencing the physical activity in the fresh air. I think we've all seen how this works during the pandemic, when we enjoyed our lunch walks or weekend trips in a different way than maybe we did before. So you see that heritage has a lot to offer here to all these dimensions, but the terms in which this is being framed are completely different from what people focused on before. There's no talk here about the nation, for example, even though identity is still mentioned, that there may be some aspects to that, but it's not the dominant one. And it's not about monetary values of anything, really. This is very much in what goes on from a people-centered perspective in relation to the visitors, to the people who are engaging themselves with the heritage or the historic environment in this case. Right. Now then there's here, there's of course a second country, which is not Bhutan, which is well known for promoting a different approach to politics, getting away from GDP and focusing on well-being instead. And this is New Zealand. And if you look at all of their public administration is now framed in terms of well-being, and that also applies to the Ministry for Culture and Heritage. And what you see here is a quote from their homepage of this ministry, which I copied a few days ago. So here you see a definition of cultural well-being according to the New Zealand ministry, and they define cultural well-being as the vitality that communities and individuals enjoy through participation in recreation, creative and cultural activities, and also through the freedom to retain, interpret and express their arts, history, heritage and traditions. So again, you see that heritage is not framed in terms of monuments that need to be preserved, but it's seen in relation to the benefits it provides for communities and individuals. And this is seen here as a form of cultural well-being. So completely different way of thinking about heritage. Now let's move to Europe. And of course, these trends exist not just in the UK, but throughout Europe. And there are examples in many countries, but also European-wide. And this is something I came across recently, a European report. One of the projects that they funded over recent years, in this case, the European Regional Development Fund was involved. And there's a project called EUniWell, which stands for Cultural Heritage as a Source of Societal Well-being in European Regions. So you have the same sort of phrases here and the same ambition than what I've shown you before. And this is all about the linkages between cultural heritage and societal well-being. So you recognize the terms and the thinking behind this. And we can look also at another document here that is from a different section of the European web pages where policy is defined. And even here you see that there is a whole section on cohesion and well-being. And within that, heritage plays a role. In this section here on I've layouted this a little bit. So, but this section here is the key one for heritage, where it says that emerging from a range of crises, Europe faces growing social inequalities, diverse populations, populism, radicalization, and other threats. Supporting the role of culture is a vital aspect of building social cohesion. Culture is essential for avoiding conflicts and for conflict resolution. It is an ideal means of communicating across language barriers, empowering people and facilitating social cohesion, including among refugees, migrants, and host populations. Prevents marginalization of people based on their cultural identity, social economic status, age, and other factors. So you already realize how the language here is completely people-centered and focused on the benefits, heritage, and other things, other parts of culture have for the way people live in societies and communities in Europe in this case. And then it mentions here explicitly that cultural participation also improves health and well-being. Living close to places related to Europe's cultural heritage can improve quality of life, while cultural access is one of the most important determinants of psychological well-being. Right, so you recognize the thinking here also, which is very close to the approach to the heritage, to the happiness index we saw earlier. Now, in the last few minutes, let me just very briefly take a look at the global level. What happens at the United Nations, one may ask in this context. And even though there are discussions along similar lines, for example, the World Bank has been pioneering some of these approaches on a global level in recent decades. But the United Nations themselves are lagging behind a little bit. There is this report which came last September from the Secretary General of the United Nations called Our Common Agenda, where he outlined an agenda for the future. And among the challenges mentioned there are these two, that there's a need, he argued, to re-embrace global solidarity and find new ways to work together in the world. But there's also a need to renew the social contract between governments and their people and within societies. And I think we can think of examples where this becomes manifest, and the idea that we need to work on democracy if we want to have it is commonplace today, and this is being addressed here. So this is from Antonio Guterres' document, the one I just cited. Now, what is said about this is that culture and heritage are not discussed in relation to these notions, even though quite clearly it would have a contribution to make. And we hope that in the future this will be recognized, and there will be an explicit role also for culture and heritage in this work. And there are campaigns going at the moment that are trying to promote the recognition of culture in this sense. Right, now as I come to the end, and what I have been exemplifying here today is that cultural heritage is something completely different today than what it used to be. even though there are overlaps with the original or first way in which it was seen and put to use in society. We can see that there's a trend from saving monuments, which was very much the focus originally throughout the 19th century and also into the 20th century, first half of the 20th century. And increasingly, it has been seen in terms of managing values, often monetary values, but also other values, social values, for example. And this is something that has been discussed extensively during the 90s, especially. But in recent years, last 10 or 15 years, the emphasis has been more and more on a people-centered approach, on people's well-being, and on caring for people, and how heritage can play a role in that. And that's sort of, I would say, this is almost the dominant way in which people in global policymaking think about heritage at the moment. Now, what are the implications for that? And you could see this in two ways. Will this new focus on well-being make cultural heritage more or less important, and in what way? And if I was setting an essay question for students, then this would be a good question, because you can argue that it makes it less important, as people are no longer really need to, it's no longer artifact focused in the same extent. It doesn't really matter how old an object is or exactly what the details are. But you could also say it makes the cultural heritage more important because it is connected much more firmly to people's well-being, to their lives, and improves quality of life in a much bigger way than what was ever perceived, recognized before. So here's an image at the end of taken from, you could call this a part of the heritage of heritage. This is an image from David Lowenthal's book, The Past is a Foreign Country, which is sort of behind a lot of the thinking in heritage studies still today. Well, Emmeline, what's new? And the point, of course, was that there are lots of antiquities, ever more antiquities. But today, with this thinking on well-being, you could say what's new is that, well, we actually focus on the people, on the two ladies that are sitting there. How are they feeling in relation to the heritage? And maybe that has changed during the course of their lives, or given the circumstances where they are at the moment. So you could say that this is the new focus in the present. Right, and so that brings me to the end, and I said I would return to this idea of heritage futures, and the importance of the focus on the future is connected to this idea of well-being, because if heritage is sort of bound to its time and has specific, it goes through specific stages and has different uses in different historic periods. And if we focus now increasingly on the uses it has for people, the benefits it brings to people, then then it makes it worthwhile to ask, well, what's the future going to bring? And for example, in 20 or 30 years, how can we best provide benefits to future generations, contribute to their well-being, their needs and their benefits, recognizing that they will not be the same as today, and how do we relate heritage to their needs? What can we know about their needs? Because we can't know everything, obviously. We can know certain things, but not a great deal we cannot know. So this is where the future comes in, where anticipation and foresight come in, and that's why it matters to build futures thinking in the heritage sector and establish, hopefully, some more futures literacy. So, and on that note, I want to say thank you for your attention. And if you are curious to hear more about what you're doing, then there's our webpage where you can go in and learn more. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Cornelius, for your presentation here. It was nice to hear this one, and now I open up for Q&A function, and it's open already, and you can put your questions there if you like from the audience. I have one question. It's about that we actually live now in a quite unhappy and unruly world, and what matters there when it comes to heritage, because there is a tendency, I would say, because you mentioned nationalism as something that perhaps is fading away, and I see the opposite tendency, that perhaps nationalism is something that is very much strengthened in an unruly situation like the one we live in now. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. That and that's why I mentioned Ukraine also as an example. It is not that, and that's obvious. And in fact, you may argue that it maybe never was that, and it's we're being reminded of this all the time at the moment, as you say. So so that's also why I've phrased this as complementary stages. So tourism is also still here, and it's still important to account financially for the benefits of heritage. But other things have sort of complemented these approaches, and where they sort of where new things, where innovation happens at the moment, and where new policies are being created, that's no longer about financial benefits, and it's no longer about promoting the nation state. I think that's quite clear, even though a lot of approaches still are framed within this context. And I think as and when the international organizations will start rebuilding Ukraine, then also the focus will be automatically on concrete benefits and well-being of the people who will inhabit that area. So I think that's inevitably going to come as well, which doesn't completely contradict the national approach, but it sort of adds to it and a different dimension.
Mm-hmm. Is there, I know you have been working with the concept of destruction and heritage. Is there some kind of well-being connected with the destruction of heritage, would you say? Is there anything to gain from what is seen as a catastrophe in the present? Past, present, future, I think there.
That's a good question, because that's exactly the way why I have focused on destruction a lot, and as you know, I argued a few times that there are at least as many benefits one can gain from destroyed heritage than from still existing heritage. So it's not at all clear. If you look at benefits for people, it's not at all clear that sort of conservation is the way to go. For example, primary examples are the Berlin Wall, which one of them, which is much more present in people's minds, and in fact, it's also as a distributed monument. There are lots of, for example, in Hamburg is a part of the Berlin Wall, and many places, I think in New York, is also part of the Berlin Wall. It's as a monument and also a reminder of a particular phase in history. It's much more powerful now that it is no longer existent in Berlin than it did before. You can also cite the Bamiyan Buddhas that were in fact only put on the World Heritage list after they had been destroyed, not before. Or the World Trade Center in New York has more visitors today than it ever had before, even though it no longer exists. So it's a different matter to discuss what effects does heritage have for communities and for people, and how do we fulfill them in the best way. And it's not automatically conservation. So this is very much the point I was making. And of course, at the same time, you can argue that in some cases, the heritage that still exists actually makes life worse for people and risks to create harm. For example, if you think about Islamic State or the Taliban, I mean, they are also focusing very much on their heritage. Now that's, it may be physical, but very often it's intangible in those cases, because it's particular traditions, and it's connected to religion and certain values and so on. And there maybe we don't want to promote the conservation of that heritage in order to benefit even themselves, but we may focus on different values and think that this would be much better for the world, connected to human rights and so on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that discussion, Cornelius. I think it's very interesting. What I can see, there is one more question. There is one question in the chat here. Thank you, from Erik Falk. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I wonder, could you give an example of how the values of this well-being approach to cultural heritage have been measured and evaluated in terms of its impact on various groups?
Yes, what not sure if that's exactly what you want to know, but I know one of something I've looked into in recent weeks actually is the question of trust in society, which is one of the key dimensions that many global policy documents at the moment emphasize. Both it's part of our common agenda approach, but it's also something that the OECD, for example, has emphasized for some time, because we see that there's a lack of trust in the world on international level. I mean, it's not just Russia and Ukraine, but it's also the US and China. And it's Europe and China and also and all sorts of other places where people are distinctively suspicious of people from other nations, and also within societies there are all sorts of groups that have different values and different ways of living, and there's a lack of trust between people, which supports crime and all sorts of conflicts that don't make our life better, but probably worse. So the question is to what extent heritage could make a difference to that, and there are established ways in which you can measure the trust that heritage generates, for example, by creating a sense of a community which you all belong to, rather than communities that are separated by different heritages. So like, this is my heritage and my community, and you come from a different group and you have your own heritage and your community. That doesn't generate trust. But if you find commonalities, things that you share, that you're sort of part of a bigger group together, then it's much easier to see, well, we're part of the same group, we share so many things, we should trust each other. I think that's what you'll find in your personal lives. The better you get to know somebody because you share certain interests, the more you trust them. And it's the same in bigger groups. And that sort of trust, since you're asking about measuring, that can be measured. You can ask people, the OECD has done a whole big report on measuring trust. You ask them, about situations, how would you act if you meet a person like this? Would you trust them with certain things? Or how would you perceive them? These are things that there's social science research that measures that. So you could have a heritage approach, and then before and after measure the level of trust and see if it has made any impact on this. Not sure, Eric, if this is what you asked, but maybe some of it.
Thank you very much, Cornelius. You mentioned lastly in your presentation about the UN and our common agenda, about re-embracing global solidarity and renewing the social contract. And perhaps that was written in the age of the pandemic. And then we now enter a stage of war in the world, and perhaps regionally right now, but it's also affecting a huge part of the world as it is right now. And where is the role of heritage here? Because heritage and well-being makes, in my eyes at least, heritage partly decorative, partly nice, partly something that is healing us. And then we know also that heritage is very loaded with identities and conflicts, inherent conflicts and so on. So what do you see for the future here? Is it just wishful thinking from the UN that we can really re-embrace and renew, or is it possible to do this with the aid of heritage, cultural heritage?
There certainly are cases where this is working, but you're right that it's not always working, which must mean that we just need to try harder, because we can't give up to work for peace and solidarity between people. And yes, this was written during the pandemic, which I think is sort of, although it's not dependent on it, but it's maybe obvious that this is what they had in mind when they wrote it. But even today, with the war ongoing in Ukraine, I think you can definitely see there's a lack of solidarity on both sides, on various sides, all kinds of sides in this sense. And that some people in Russia even perceived some sort of suspicion about the direction the Ukraine was taking, that they didn't trust them to sort of have the best in mind for everybody, really, and not to be a threat for Russians, for example. And that just shows that the level of suspicion was just too high, and that different national traditions were not sort of sufficiently in line with each other, that something like this was possible. Now, I realize that the decisions in Russia are not made by the population, but by a very small group, presumably, of the government. But even that they think like this is not, of course, something that is positive in any way, and it is a lot to do with history and heritage. And we know that Putin has written long essays on the history and heritage of the Ukraine, and so this is very much legitimated with that sort of thinking. And I think many people, sort of tacitly at least, accept that in some way in Russia. And on the other hand, Ukraine also mobilizes notions of heritage. We see all these messages now about protecting the museums and the cultural heritage in Ukraine. Whenever the president speaks, it's with a national flag behind, which represents, of course, the nation state, and all the European states that are supporting the Ukraine, and also the US and others. It's always done in, our prime minister always emphasizes how this is done in the best national interest to send weapons to Ukraine. So it's not motivated by human rights. It's motivated by what is in the Swedish nation's interest. And I think it would be much better to sort of see that the Ukrainians are people in the same way that we are people. So that's why we need to help them, especially on a humanitarian way, of course, and or on whatever dimension is possible, instead of emphasizing the nation. And everybody here is concerned with, well, what if the Russians attack us? And is our army big enough? You know, this is not challenging the notion that there should be different nations that sometimes have war with each other, which is maybe what is needed. So I think heritage is very much on the agenda at the moment, and even more so. And if there's anything that we need, then it's more projects that support well-being rather than the glory of nation states.
Thank you for that. Those words at the end of this presentation, Cornelius. I think we live here in the tension between heritage, nationalism, the global and the local, and we can continue to do so. And I think we have been quite elucidated by your presentation today. And thank you with an applaud from us all. Yeah. Thanks and goodbye, and thanks to the audience too who has attended this presentation. Goodbye, everyone.